Want to welcome everyone to the mandate with MaShani Allen. So glad to have you all here on this evening. We have definitely been taking our time looking at the life of Jesus and who he is. And over the past few teachings, we have looked at his life compared or in tandem with the lives of other people. And last week, I was just going about my day and I had a thought, and it was concerning the disciples. And it was just like, just because they walked with him didn't mean they operated like him. Let me say that again. Just because they walked with him doesn't mean they operated like him. And I was like, okay, I know this is going to be a Bible study because when you think about it, they didn't just walk with Jesus. They were literally walking with the word, living, breathing, doing life with the very word that we read. They were doing life with the word, and in all of that, spending all of that time with him, it did not make an automatic of them becoming like him. And I think that it's important that we look at this because a lot of times we assume, and I have been guilty of this myself, we assume that because people go to church, because people say they read their Bibles, because people call themselves Christians, we assume that certain characteristics that should be there, we assume that they will be there. But sadly, sometimes they're not. And I think that we need to come to the truth that you can be around the word, you can be connected to the word, you can know the people who carry the word, but until you make the choice on a daily basis to be image and likeness, things won't change. And I want us to look at when I was preparing for this, I was like, okay, I know where I want us to go because I think that this is very significant. I want us to look at Matthew 14, and this is a very familiar passage. This is when Jesus was feeding the multitudes. So we're going to look at Matthew 14 because, again, the disciples are a part of this. They aren't just witnesses, they are partakers, in the life of Jesus. They are partakers in the signs, the miracles, and the wonders. They are literal partakers, but still, we can see where they still didn't fully function like him. And we can be partakers, but our desire is not just to be partakers, but to literally function like him as well. So, looking at Matthew 14, and it's verses 15 through 21, and you all know the Amplified Version is my favorite version of the Bible, so we're going to be reading from that. It says, okay, how do I want to do this? I think I want to make a statement first. Before I get to verse 15, I want you to know what happened in verse 12 and verse 13. I think that's how I want to play this out. So in verses 12 and 13 is when John the Baptist ends up being beheaded in verse 12. And in verse 13 is when Jesus learns about John the Baptist being beheaded and he withdraws from the people, but the people still follow him. So I want to make sure I paint this picture before we go into this. So we should know who John the Baptist is, and I think it's significant for us to, before I do this, let me do it this way. So John the Baptist, we know he's the one that baptized Jesus, but more than that, we learn about who he is to God and who he is to heaven from the mouth of Jesus. And this is found in Luke chapter 7, and it's verses 24 through 27. And this is when he is talking to the crowd, which includes the Sadducees and the Pharisees. He's talking to them about John the Baptist. And I think it's significant that you know who Jesus just found out was killed. So it says in Luke 7, verse 24, when John's messengers left, Jesus began speaking to the crowds about John. What did you go out to the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing, entirely unsuited for a harsh wilderness? Those who wear splendid clothing and live in luxury are in royal palaces. But what did you really go out to see? A prophet. Yes, I say to you, and one far more eminent and remarkable than a prophet. This is the one of whom it was written by the prophet Malachi. Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. And I tell you, among those born of women, there is no one greater than John. This is who Jesus had just heard had passed away before we get to verse 15. Hold that thought as we read what now happens. So in Matthew 14, verse 15, it says, we'll start at verse 14. Well, we'll just start at 13. When Jesus heard it, so I kind of didn't want to start there without telling you what happened. When Jesus heard it, when he heard about the passing of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there privately in a boat to a solitary place. But when the crowds heard of it, they followed him by land and on foot from the towns. When he went ashore and saw a great throng of people, he had compassion, pity, and deep sympathy for them, and cured their sick. When evening came, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote and barren place, and the day is now over. Send the throngs away into the villages to buy food for themselves." Jesus said, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." They said to him, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes." He said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to recline on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to the heavens, he gave thanks and blessed and broke the loaves and handed the pieces to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, not including women and children. Here you have Jesus finding out someone as dear as John is no longer here. And that grief and pain did not stop his love from flowing. That grief and pain did not stop healing from being received. That grief and pain could not stop love. Now, when I read it the way I did, because you can hear Jesus, i.e., love, constantly being concerned about people. Even though he may have been in pain, he was still moved with compassion when he looked at this crowd. But the disciples who are with the word, who are sleeping, eating, talking, laughing, walking on water, going through storms, all this they have done with the word. They have seen what the word can do, but they still weren't able to have the lens of love that the word had. So as much as the word can be heard, seen, taught, and shouted on, we have to get to the point where it's not just words, but it shifts to allow us to have a lens of love. Again, Jesus performed this miracle after learning he was really his family member, became a friend, and the greatest prophet had just been beheaded. None of this stopped his desire to heal. None of this stopped his desire to care. None of this stopped his desire to feed. He still had a heart to feed the people. What I wrote here was, when you look at this passage, you see the level of loss, but in spite of it, he still healed and fed. This is how powerful love is. Love does not have any boundaries, and love does not have any bars. But that's when it's the lens of Jesus. Clearly, the disciples had an attitude. Clearly, they like, God, let them go fend for themselves. Let them go into the town. Let them, let them handle it. Let them figure it out. But love said, no, 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 no. Sit them down. What do you have in your hand? Because love is so powerful. If you don't have it, for the masses, I'll create it and multiply it so they can be fed. That's what love did, and that's what love does. When we place what we have in our hands, in his hands, love multiplies. But the disciples, they didn't get it. But this is the tripped out part. So we see, and I remember the first time I discovered this, because I've rarely heard people talk about this next thing. So here we have again in Matthew 14. Again, that's Matthew chapter 14. We see Jesus has fed 5,000 people. Go one chapter over, Matthew 15. And we're going to look at verses 32 through 39, because I remember the first time I discovered this, I was like, nobody ever showed me this in the Bible. Like, I don't even hear people talk about this. So Matthew 15, verses 32 through 39. Nope, let's start at verse 29. And Jesus went on from there and passed along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up into the hills and kept sitting there. And a great multitude came to him, bringing with them the lame, the maimed, the blind, the dumb, and many others. And they put them down at his feet, and he cured them. Mind you, this could have been less than a week apart. This could have been less than days apart. The thought of losing John the Baptist is still very much real and still very much alive to Jesus. But we see again, and it said a multiple, it's not like one or two people that's coming down to the altar. No, it's a whole multitude of people that, let me read again, maimed, blind, dumb, lame, and many others. And compassion and love, despite the grief, he is healing all of them. Let me keep going. Verse 31. So that the crowd was amazed when they saw the dumb speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And they recognized and praised and thanked and glorified the God of Israel. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have pity and sympathy and am deeply moved for the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and they have had nothing at all left to eat. And I am not willing to send them away hungry, lest they faint or become exhausted on the way. And the disciples said to him, where are we to get bread sufficient to feed so great a crowd in this isolated and desert place? Y'all, these are the same men whose hands were literally breaking bread, breaking fish, and it was multiplying in their hands just a chapter before. But here we have the same scenario, and they confused. When you are not operating from a lens of love, everything is a complication and a difficulty. It wasn't that way for Jesus. Let me keep going. It says, and Jesus asked them, how many loaves of bread do you have? They replied, 7, and a few small fish. This the tripped out part. It's not like they had something different. It's not like they said, we got apples and bananas. They had the exact same formula. The exact, not the same number, but the same food. Same bread, same fish. But somehow, because they didn't have the lens of love or the attribute of love, they didn't see how that could work. Now, this baffles me because it's not like it was a whole new set of disciples that he was asking this question to. This the same group of people, the same brothers that just did this for 5,000 people. Now it's 4,000 people. In verse 36, no, in verse 35, and ordering the crowd to recline on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they gathered up 7 baskets full of the broken pieces that were left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men. I hope y'all flowing with me because this is taking me out. The reason why I'm sharing this and the reason why I feel as though this is relevant is because, again, like I said, we can feel that when people go to church, they should then reflect image and likeness. Going in buildings and being close to people doesn't mean you reflect what you are hearing. It doesn't even mean you reflect what you are seeing, and it doesn't mean that you reflect what you have even been a part of. Proximity does not guarantee intimacy. Closeness to people does not automate closeness to God. What they saw as annoying, Jesus saw as a love opportunity. Image and likeness always has a lens of love. This lens of love is not moved by the mere attitudes and opinions of men. You can clearly see the disciples are a little annoyed and a little aggravated, but none of that stopped Jesus from loving on the multitude. And we have to get to the point where we can operate like Jesus through this lens of love, that despite what it looks like, despite what others may think, or even the attitudes and opinions that they may have, we forever focus through a lens of love. And we let that be how we operate, because that is what image and likeness does. But I think that it is so interesting to look at the stark contrast of the posture and the position that Jesus had when he looked at the people, and the posture and the position that the disciples had when they looked at the people. The crowd was the same, but the perspective of the people varied from him to them. And we want to make sure that we are those who have his lens and not their lens. So I pray that you all were blessed by this Bible study, and I will see you next week.